Israel versus Iran. Is this the beginning of the end? Now, that may sound a little bit hyperbolic, but if you know your Bible prophecy, you know that this is a battle that has been long in the making, but one that when it was first prophesied about in the Old Testament, it seems really out of place. So in this video, we're going to talk about this long winding road that Israel and Iran have taken to find themselves at this place opposing each other. We just did a whole message, 40-minute message, special message about this subject. You can find the full message wherever you get your podcasts. Look up Risen Church NC. Go to soundcloud.com/Risen Church NC, or if you're watching this on Facebook, you can find a link previously posted on either my personal page or the church's page. But let's talk about Israel versus Iran. In the Old Testament, there are many passages that prophesy and foretell about Israel facing off against any number of the Middle Eastern countries. And many of those have already been fulfilled. And sometimes the Old Testament prophecies work in such a way that you can see that there was an immediate fulfillment, but there also is a long-term prophecy still there, like when it talks about Israel versus Babylon, or Israel versus this nation or that nation. You might could interpret that as being something that already took place, or maybe something that will still yet take place, in that Babylon is often referred to as this one world government in the book of Revelation. And does that refer to a future battle? Who knows? But to not get too off the point, there is one passage in Ezekiel 38 that talks about Israel facing off against Persia, the ancient name for Iran. And there's nowhere in the Old Testament, and up until this point, there's never been a point in history where Israel and Persia, or modern day Iran, where Israel and Persia ever faced off in any sort of conflict. In fact, Persia is a nation that is remembered for playing a key role in restoring Israel from captivity, from many of the previous battles and conflicts that left it in disarray and left it divided and dispersed. Persia, the empire that was ruled by Cyrus the Great, he is one anointed by God who helped Israel restore from captivity. So when all of a sudden you read in Ezekiel that God foretells of a battle between Israel and Persia, it seems very odd because it just wasn't in the cards back then. It never happened in the time of Israel's previous existence, pre-70 AD, and it hasn't happened until right here, right now in our world today. And it's been brewing. If you've been paying attention to the news, if you've studied history for the last 100 years, you know that this battle between Israel and Persia, or Israel and Iran, has been brewing for several decades. But when that prophecy was originally given, it just seems kind of odd. But let's talk about what happened between when the prophecy was given and where we are now in the world, and why it actually makes sense that Israel and Iran became these fierce rivals. So when Israel was restored from captivity by the Persian government, they gained a semblance of independence, but it really wasn't like it used to be. When the Persian Empire fell to the Greek Empire, and eventually the Greek Empire divided up into 4 different territories. The territory that was in control of the Middle East, and under a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, he wreaked havoc on the Jews, and again brought them under some sort of bondage, and they fought him off. They gained a little bit of freedom again. Rome came in and said, none of that, we're going to rule the world, we're going to rule you, and also to insult you, we're going to put a foreigner in control of this territory. They picked an Edomite, a descendant of Esau, who had an axe to grind against Israel, and they always felt scorned and felt like they had been done wrong by God. So they get power over Israel. Herod the Great, not so great according to the Jews, but Herod the Great ruled, and his descendants ruled the area of Judea. So eventually Israel becomes such a thorn in Rome's side because of all the turmoil around Jesus and all the conflicts between the Jews and the Romans. Eventually Rome says, you know what? Enough of this. They go in 70 AD, they raze Jerusalem, they burn the temple down, they put an end to Judaism, hopefully to put an end of all the conflicts within the Jewish people in the empire by putting an end to Israel. And in 70 AD, Israel ceases to exist. And in that vacuum, without an Israel in the Middle East, and with Rome coming in and renaming the place Palestine as an insult to the Jews, referencing their old enemy, the Philistines, in that vacuum, the Middle East really changes, and in terms of its structure, in the terms of the history that is told. Over the next few hundred years, the nations around Israel that are kind of glad that Israel finally got what they thought was coming, they begin to rewrite history. And out of that new direction and out of that erasure of Israel, the Middle Eastern nations kind of combine together, and eventually a new religion is born called Islam in 600 or so AD. And Islam basically says Judaism has lied to you, the Christians are wrong, they're the enemies. And Islam tells a new version of the history of the Middle East, associating with some of the characters we read about in the Old Testament, but it's very much a revised story. So with history rewritten, the Middle Eastern nations all combined together around this new Islamic faith. And if you know your history from around 600 AD all the way up until 1900 AD, the Middle Eastern nations come together and form an Islamic empire, which they believe is going to set the stage for the Muslim Messiah. This empire stretches from the Middle East all the way over to Africa, even into parts of Southern Europe for a brief period of time. And because Rome had empowered this area, they actually end up surviving, outlasting the Roman Empire well after Rome had ceased to be, past the Byzantine Empire. And this group, we know them in their most recent form as the Ottoman Empire, that ruled the region up until the early 1900s. And they were part of the Axis of Evil in World War I. But we all know that the Axis loses in World War I, and that left a vacuum in the Middle East. All these nations of the Ottoman Empire are fractured and dispersed, and that leaves kind of a mess. Well, not that many years later, World War II happens. And of course, with World War II, Nazi Germany targets the Jewish people who had been dispersed throughout Europe and parts of Western Russia, Eastern Europe, and Germany targets the Jews and says they're the problem. They have always been a problem. They've been meandering around the world for the last 2,000 years, and we're going to put an end to these people because they've always been a problem. Well, of course, in the aftermath of World War II, United Nations gets involved, and they come together to help restore the Jewish people to their homeland. And since the Middle East was a mess post-World War I, it was very easy to draw lines according to how they desired and according to how they saw fit. So finally, the Jews seem like they get the last word. Middle East is divided up. Israel is given back to the Jews, and the territory, of course, is put back under their authority, and the Jewish people are emboldened by the United Nations support and by their resources. The Jewish people, not many years after being reformed in 1948, they actually expand in the Six-Day War in 1967 and begin taking more territory, and they're set on getting everything that they believe the Old Testament promises is theirs, or is rightfully theirs. Well, that's what leads us to our modern world. Because these Middle Eastern nations, they always didn't like the Jews, and now they felt like they got what was theirs, it was taken from them, and now, this insult to injury, the Jews are back and Israel is back, and they vow that they're going to put an end to the Jewish people. And rising up out of all this is the nation of Iran, the old Persia, newly formed in really the heart of the old Islamic empire. Iran spends many decades, from 1948 up until the very recent years, saying some pretty terrible things about the Jewish people, calling them Satan's children, referring to them as cancer, and all other sorts of insults. And in 2005, the Iranian president cast a vision for a world without Zion. And they had been making threats against Israel going back into the 70s. And every time there was a threat raised, the United Nations got involved and helped cool things off. But Iran cast a vision for a world without Zion and a restoration of the Islamic Empire to set the stage for their Messiah to come. Well, in 2011, something called the Arab Spring took place, which was revolutions all throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa, in the very territory that used to be the Islamic Empire. And this Arab Spring was really about all these governments being upended and led by these zealots and these revolutionaries who wanted to set the stage for this Islamic Empire to come back. And really the aftermath of that is a bunch of governments that really aren't that strong, and a bunch of division throughout all parts of Africa and the Middle East. And really you have Syria and Iran ultimately joining together to form ISIS, the Islamic State of Iran and Syria. And they had aspirations to include more, but it was just them. And then over the last decade, ISIS was sort of dissolved. Syria had its own problem with its own people. The United States got involved in a couple different times. So then it's just back to being Iran. So really, if you were to read Ezekiel 38, at any point before 1948, it just didn't make any sense for there to ever be a conflict between Persia and Israel. Because before 1948, going all the way back to 70, there was no Israel. And before then, there really wasn't ever a point when Persia and Israel were at odds with each other. They were two ships passing in the night. It just there's no way to interpret it. Until now, when Iran has been making threats against Israel for the last 50 or 60 years. And finally, they make the first move. Finally, they have attacked Israel. And Israel has vowed to get revenge. And this plays right in to what Ezekiel 38 talks about. A war between Israel and Iran that really sets the stage for the very end of this age. Ezekiel 38 also talks about other nations being involved, northern kingdoms, Rosh, Mesech, and Tubal, which many can draw lines from ancient days to now to mean Russia and Turkey, that eastern bloc of Europe. And lo and behold, Russia is trying to gain more and more territory of the old Soviet Eastern Bloc. Turkey is one of their few allies, and Iran is one of their few allies, because as Russia has been isolated from the West because of the Ukraine war, Russia has gotten more and more embedded with Middle Eastern allies. So now you have Ezekiel 38 staring at us once again, even more clearly. This is setting the stage. So could it be that Iran has attacked Israel and is going to realize they need a little bit more help than just what they have on their own? Will they seek help from Russia? Will they seek help from Turkey? It makes sense that they would, and it seems like that's going to happen in the future. And that's the only way we can interpret Ezekiel 38. And with 37 being the restoration of Israel, which happened in 1948, 40 talking about the rebuilding of the temple, and Israel having gained all this land, we are on the threshold of seeing prophecy fulfilled. Again, there's no way it could be interpreted before this current conflict. And it's all signs seem to point that this is what Ezekiel saw. This is the reality that he saw in the future. So you and I are here on the precipice of seeing prophecy fulfilled. And what does that mean for us? It just means that the last days are at hand. It means that the church age could be coming to an end. It means that God is going to restore Israel once again in that 7-year tribulation period, that time of Jacob's trouble that the Bible talks about, that comes at the end of this age. It is right upon us. So you and I should take very seriously that Iran threatened for decades to attack Israel, and they finally did it. And finally, Ezekiel 38 seems like it could be fulfilled. So pay attention to the news. Don't take lightly what's going on in the world. Pay close attention to it. And may we be prepared for the Lord's soon return. Now you know how Israel and Iran, formerly allies, but now arch rivals. And you might think this is a little bit of a stretch, but I argue with you. What else do you do with that text? What else do you do with this scripture that makes it very clear that Israel and Persia are going to face off? We're forced to figure it out. And I would argue we are on the threshold of seeing it all play out. Thanks for joining us for this video today. I would encourage you to listen to the longer, larger message for more details. But until next time, keep your eyes on Israel. And keep your eyes on what God has said he will do. And may we be prepared to meet Jesus, who's coming very soon. God bless you. Have a great one. See you next time.